the Honorable Richard J. Solello presiding.
Please be seated. The defendant is here with us, together with the attorneys. The jury is not in the courtroom yet. We need to take up some legal matters. Counsel worked last evening and afternoon evening and agreed upon a set of instructions which I reviewed and agree with. I intend to give them all, but I'm going to change the order. I'm going to give 311 through 320 at the end of the instructions. So if you can make a note of that. Any objection to that?
No objection.
All right, and as I understand it, counsel have agreed on these instructions. They don't object to any of the instructions that have been agreed to, and they do not want any additional instructions in addition to these, correct?
Correct.
Correct, Your Honor.
Now, we had that one matter Friday afternoon. Ms. Cole, you didn't bring it up. Nobody brought it up. And I told you what my inclination was. Are you still believing that you should have been allowed to get into that Indiana matter?
Your Honor, at this time we would withdraw our motion.
Okay, good. Is that covered, Mr. Shulman?
That'll be fine, Your Honor.
All right. Was there anything else?
I think just for housekeeping purposes, Your Honor, I think numerous exhibits have been marked, and I think by stipulation we'd ask that all the joint exhibits that were marked be omitted if they weren't previously omitted. By stipulation, again, I would agree that all the people's exhibits that were marked would also be omitted this time. While there were 3 defense exhibits that were marked, they were never offered, they were never introduced even. I'm withdrawing them, so there should be no defense exhibits this time. So again, we just have all the joint and all the people's exhibits. And again, anything we dismissed it by chance, we ask that they be included at this time.
They'll be received. I think we have people's 1 through...
Your Honor, Peoples 1 and 2 were demonstrative exhibits that we did not include in the jury exhibit book per our discussion yesterday.
Okay. So does that help you out?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Do you need any more clarification?
No, thank you.
Okay.
And finally, again, I'll just review my motion I believe I made, I think it was Thursday afternoon, for directed verdict on the same grounds that I made at that time, Your Honor.
For the same reasons, I'm recognizing there's a different standard at this stage of the proceedings and denying.
Thank you.
All right. Anything else before we bring the jury in?
All rise. Thank you. I have 2 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
Do you want me to do that? Draw the names?
The jury's not with us. Please be seated, everyone. Members of the jury, good morning. Good morning. This is coming to a close. What is left are the closing arguments of counsel, after which I will instruct you on the law that you are to apply, and then unlike all the other recesses, will be instructing you to deliberate and to hopefully decide this case. Ms. Paul, your opening statement.
Thank you, Your Honor.
I mean, close tonight.
A couple weeks. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
First of all, I want to thank you for your service and your sacrifice here these past 2.5 weeks. It's been a long trial, and no doubt it was inconvenient for you, your family, and your employers. Without people to serve on a jury, however, our system would break down. This is an important duty, and we do appreciate you fulfilling it for us. I also want to ask that if Mr. Scholke or I did something that offended you during this trial or something that you did not approve of, please take the time to set that aside during deliberations and not hold it against either the people of the state of Michigan or against the defendant. The ultimate goal in this case has been and always will be justice. Ladies and gentlemen, when we started this case, I told you that the Cochrans were bonded in blood. I asked you to meet the Cochrans, that they moved to Iron River for the medical marijuana card, that Jason claimed to be disabled with sciatica and disc problems, that Kelly was the worker of the family while they lived in Iron River. She was employed at Ace Hardware, Mr. T's, and finally Oldenburg. The Cochrans are bonded in blood. The defendant's testimony, as you heard, is that they had marital problems prior to moving to Iron River. Yet she moved with Jason Cochran anyway, and they bought a house in September of 2014. Those problems escalated when she started seeing numerous men and culminated with the death of Christopher Regan on October 14, 2014. Jason Cochran and Kelly Cochran are bonded in blood. That bond only got stronger after Chris's death, according to the defendant. But more important than meeting the Cochrans, I want you to meet Christopher Carl Regan, as he was in life and as he is in death. Christopher Regan was a 20-year Air Force veteran who moved to Iron County to be near his then-girlfriend, Terry O'Donnell. He was a veteran of the Gulf War and served his country with distinction. He left two amazing children, Cameron and Christopher Cochran. He met Kelly Cochran after his relationship with Terry fizzled. He began a sexual relationship with her at the end of July in 2014, or early August 2014. He was excited. He was beginning a new chapter in his life. He was moving to North Carolina and starting a job at Republic Services. This was a state that he'd been stationed in previously in his life, so he was familiar with it. He knew that there were mountains and there was ocean and there were valleys in between. He loved the outdoors. He loved wine. He loved biking especially, and kayaking. He took his camera with him wherever he went to record his adventures. On that fateful day on October 14, 2014, the defendant and Jason Cochran bonded in blood, while Christopher Carl Regan ended up bathed in it. I want to summarize some of the testimony for you. For some of you, this may be an exercise in patience. I realize you just sat through this trial. However, experience has taught me that after a lengthy trial, you tend to forget details that happened during the first week. Terry O'Donnell testified that on October 27, 2014, she went to the Iron River Police Department to report her ex-boyfriend, Chris Regan, as missing. She'd not heard from him since October 14, 2014, when they exchanged texts in the morning. She became concerned as additional texts and calls went unanswered. She found out through a mutual friend that Chris Regan's car was at the park and ride in Bates Township. She saw in the car a knee brace, a spittoon, a yellow Post-it note, his water bottle. There were items in there that she knew he would not leave behind. She was able to gain access to the car, and she was able to gain access to his apartment. She saw the apartment was disheveled and in disarray, not the way that Chris Regan she knew would leave it. Now, Terry was also aware that Chris had gotten a job offer from Republic Services in Asheville, North Carolina. She was aware that he was supposed to go for a drug test on Wednesday, October 15th at the Marshfield Clinic. After seeing his apartment, she was concerned and met Chief Laura Frizzo as she was going into the Iron River Police Department. Terry O'Donnell advised officers that evening that she had heard he was seeing a woman from work named Kelly. Chief Frizzo turned the missing person complaint over to Sergeant Barrett for the evening. Terry O'Donnell testified that Chris would normally have his cell phone, an iPhone, which was an iPhone, his car keys, apartment keys, his wallet, a watch, and a necklace on him. That he often traveled with a camera because he loved to take pictures of places he had been. That he wore reading glasses and prescription glasses for work. That he chewed Copenhagen regularly and carried a real rabbit's foot for luck when he felt he needed it. Terry testified that when she dated Chris Regan, he would take her out for dinner. They would go to wineries, visit the ice caves, things like that. She described Chris as a guy who made his women feel special. She testified that in addition to the Hyundai Genesis that was parked and locked at the park and ride, he also drove a white, smaller truck, and it had a kayak on it. Other than the rumors about this woman named Kelly at his work, she didn't know of any other women he might be seeing, but she did know that he liked to frequent dating sites. Sergeant Barrett testified that she assisted Terry O'Donnell with her missing person complaint that evening. She and Terry went to look at the apartment and the car. She observed that he was packing with numerous reminder notes and to-do lists around the apartment, that there was paperwork regarding the job offer, the drug test, and the move, and that there was a handwritten note from Dr. Klein advising that Chris Regan was taking Percocet for his knee. Sergeant Barrett testified there was medication at the apartment, but couldn't be sure if all of the medication was present. She contacted Iron County Central Dispatch with a request that they contact Verizon and ping his phone. Verizon received no ping on the phone, meaning it was turned off or it wasn't charged. Contact was made with the Veteran Affairs Hospital. Maybe Chris was there for some reason, but he wasn't. When Sergeant Barrett went to Chris's vehicle that night, she found the yellow sticky note on the passenger seat. Terry O'Donnell advised Sergeant Barrett that Chris Regan, if he was going to a location for the first time, would always write directions down on a yellow sticky note. In this case, the yellow note in the car turned out to be directions. After a discussion with Chief Rizzo, it was determined the directions were to the Cochran residence on 66 Lawrence Street. On October 27, 2014, Sergeant Barrett and a trooper from the Michigan State Police went to the Cochran residence to ask about Chris Regan. When they knocked on the door, a man came out. Sergeant Barrett asked for Kelly Cochran, and the man said he was her husband, Jason, and she wasn't home. When asked when Kelly Cochran would be returning home, he said in an hour. Shortly thereafter, Kelly Cochran came outside. She told Sergeant Barrett she didn't know why her husband had lied, maybe concerned that she was in trouble or something. Sergeant Barrett asked her when she last had contact with Chris Regan, and the answer was, maybe a few weeks ago. She tried to call him via phone and sent text messages, but he didn't respond. She thought he may have left for North Carolina, but felt that it was strange that he would not respond to her. She told Sergeant Barrett she had an intimate relationship with Chris Regan, but that her husband was aware of it and he was okay with it. She said there were no problems between her husband and Chris Regan, and she could think of no one who would want to hurt Chris. Sergeant Barrett notified her that they found Chris Regan's car that night, and Kelly Cochran's response was, he loved that car. Sergeant Barrett thought it was odd that Kelly Cochran spoke of him in the past tense. Laura Sartori testified she was the human resources manager at Oldenburg, where Chris Regan was a supervisor in the military assembly line and where Kelly Cochran had been employed. Laura Sartori was able to give police dates and times Chris was at work, the last day he worked, which was October 14th, 2014, and the names of people he associated with or who knew him from work. Laura advised she was not immediately surprised when Chris Regan did not show up for work, because she had heard he was looking for another position. She was also able to give police insight into Kelly Cochran and her work history, including the day she was finally terminated, her inability to provide a medical leave slip for the injury from the infamous car accident in Green Bay, and she also testified about a well-being check that she requested be performed on Kelly Cochran at the end of September 2016. Officer Hadley testified about the pictures he took of the apartment, the vehicle, and Chris's storage unit, the electronics he seized pursuant to search warrant, and the medications he removed from the apartment. The Percocet was not one of the medications still within the apartment. Eric Erickson was someone who was listed as a possible friend of Kelly Cochran's. Police interviewed Eric and soon learned he had a relationship with Kelly Cochran, a relationship that he described as friends with benefits. Eric testified in this matter that he began seeing Kelly Cochran a couple weeks after he started at Oldenburg in mid-September 2014. That he and Kelly would text and then meet up after work for a few hours. They would have beers. They would go several places, including a place that they like to call the Spot near Wildwood Lake. He said that you would get to the Spot by turning south at the road just in front of the park and ride in Bates Township. He testified he and Kelly met several times at the park and ride in Bates Township. Eric had saved his text messages between he and Kelly Cochran and turned those over to detectives. The messages revealed that right around the time of Chris's disappearance, the defendant did not return Eric's texts or hook up with him. 2 days after Chris Regan's death, she began texting Eric again, stating her phone was broken and she just got it fixed. On October 24th, she told Eric she had to help a friend with a very big problem, and that's why she wasn't in contact with him. She also told Eric she was separated from her husband, that her husband was abusive, controlling, and that she and Chris Regan had a thing, but it was over. Chris Regan was always calling her, texting her, and it was annoying her. Now, Detective Sergeant Brackett and Detective Bellinger were the first law enforcement officers to interview Jason Cochran and Kelly Cochran. During this interview, the defendant told detectives that she would see Chris Regan at his apartment 5 to 6 times per week, that they would have dinner, sex, and then she would go home, but she never spent the night at his apartment. She said she met him at Oldenburg, that her husband knew of her relationship with him, and that they went hiking, biking, and kayaking when they were together. She said that Chris Regan had been over to her house 2 or 3 times previously, and that her husband had depression and was in a lot of pain. The defendant told detectives that her husband hadn't actually met Chris, and that she and her husband were separated but living in the same home. She was asked by detectives when she last saw Chris Regan, and she was able to narrow it down to sometime around the 13th or 14th at his house, at his apartment. She went over there around 4:30 and she left around 7:30. She brought lasagna over for dinner. They discussed his new job and he was very excited about it. That he was supposed to meet up with his son in North Carolina. She said Chris Regan asked her to go with him, but this was her home now. She described Chris as having a silver sporty vehicle and that she had been in it as well as a white truck. She said she had been calling and texting but no response and that she drove by twice. The first time she drove by, both vehicles were present there, and the second time the car was gone. She said she knocked on the door when she went there on the 15th and later said in the interview that she let herself in with a key. His apartment looked like he'd been packing and it was a mess. Not how Chris usually kept things. The defendant said her husband had known about her relationship with Chris for the last 3 months and that she told him about the relationship. When asked if Jason Cochran was ever upset about her relationship with Chris, she said no, he never was. She said Jason had depression and tried to kill himself, but did not threaten to hurt her, and she was the type of girl who wouldn't let a man push her around. The defendant was asked about her cell phone number, and she gave detectives Jason's phone number, 367-0067 or 0077. After clarification, she said it was Jason's phone number, 0066, and that they were down to 1 phone, and had been for about a week or so. She said her phone was shut off because she wasn't working, and neither was Jason, and they didn't need the added expense. Her old phone number she eventually revealed to officers as 284-3947. She denied taking anything from Chris's apartment. She gave up her phone to detectives, and she admitted to seeing Eric Erickson as well as Chris Regan. She denied Jason had anger towards her relationship and said instead that it stemmed from his health issues, which caused him to be really depressed. When she turned over her phone, she told investigators that she had erased or deleted things from her phone already. She was asked by detectives whether she used Jason's phone to call Chris, and her response was, no, she doesn't think so. When asked how her relationship was after Jason got out of the hospital, she said, it's been amazing. She has a degree in psychology and has seen some crazy things, but now he's happy. I can't see him ever doing anything to Chris because he knows how much it would hurt me, and he just wants to make me happy. They both had been violent and thrown things in the past, but she has never been abused. Jason had never been in Chris's car. He couldn't get in there with his bad back and his hips. Detective Bellinger expressed concern for the defendant's safety, and her response was that she wasn't concerned for her safety. Jason's thinking has never been clearer, and that threat the co-worker testified about was a misunderstanding. She doesn't get intimidated very easily. Detectives Brackett and Bellinger also spoke with Jason Cochran on October 28, 2014. They spoke with him after they spoke with the defendant. He started his conversation right away with the fact that he sees a therapist for anxiety and gets easily flustered. When asked if he knew why he was there, he said because his wife had been seeing Chris Regan, that he heard Chris Regan was missing, that he didn't know him. He told detectives their marriage was rocky and he had health issues. He was depressed and he couldn't move around much. He said his wife hadn't been seeing Chris lately and was home more. When pressed about what lately was, he said the last 2 to 3 weeks after he got out of the hospital. He said he had to accept his wife's relationships or let her go, and he decided to accept it for a while to see if that's what she really wanted. He said he didn't threaten her, he was always down on himself. He never thought about hurting other people, only himself. Jason Cochran said he knew where Chris Regan lived because he had seen Kelly's truck there a couple times. Jason Cochran also said that they were sharing a phone due to finances. He said only the last few days or so, though. He said he had never dated anyone outside the marriage and Kelly was the only woman he had ever loved. When asked whether the defendant was capable of doing anything to Chris Regan, he said, "I don't think so." He said there was no abuse between him and Kelly, and when asked whether he would report it even if it was Kelly doing something, he said, "Now that's a tough question. I just don't see it happening." He said Kelly was with him out of pity, but that since he got out of the hospital, it's been better and they've been spending more time together. He was tearful during this interview. Now, Detective Tom Reichela testified to several interviews he and Detective Brackett conducted with Jason Cochran and the defendant. Those interviews were on October 31st, November 4th, and December 18th of 2014. The interview from October 31st was focused on clarifying which date she actually last saw Chris Regan. Officers have been getting conflicting information from neighbors regarding when Chris was last seen around his apartment and when his vehicle was noticed at the parking ride. Defendant was eventually pinned down to last seeing Chris Regan on October 14th. She went over there around 4:30, she brought lasagna, and she brought garlic bread. She said she didn't know where her husband was that night, that she and Chris didn't have sex that night, and that Kelly Cochran also said her husband was offended by his interview with detectives on October 28th, saying he had been told that he was the primary suspect. During this interview, detectives told her he never made it to North Carolina. Her reaction was not upset, tearful, hysterical. Detectives also told her his car was left at the parking ride in Bates Township. She didn't seem to know where the parking ride was, and detectives had to explain it to her. She finally figured out it was near the Mapleton Inn. She then said Chris Regan would have no reason to be at the parking ride unless there was a hiking trail near there. She asked detectives if there was a hiking trail by the parking ride. She was asked again if she ever used her husband's phone to communicate with Chris Regan. Doesn't believe so. Her husband never contacted Chris as far as she knows. She again says she went by on Wednesday the 15th, and she initially says in the interview between 12 and 5, and then changed it to 3 and 5. Both cars were there when she went there. She said she thought Chris Regan was blowing her off when he didn't respond to her texts, and she was alternating between pissed and concerned, but more pissed that he didn't respond. The detectives asked her again the number of times Chris had been to her house. Again, she said 2 to 3 times. She gave him directions both times. He was very smart, and not poor with directions, and she couldn't explain why she needed to give him directions both times. Detectives also spoke with Jason Cochran on October 31st, 2014, and obtained his phone from him that day. He couldn't specifically remember what he was doing on October 14th, but could have been fishing or at his neighbor's, the Sailor's house. Jason Cochran again told detectives things had been better between him and his wife since he got out of the hospital. He said it was possible Chris had been to his home before. He said it had been about a month ago that he saw the defendant's truck at Chris's apartment. He said he was depressed and walked home with his head hung down. No indication that he went in or confronted Chris in any way. He said he didn't like to drive because the medical marijuana hit him hard. And they had been a hunter and had hunted before in Indiana for deer, pheasant, quail, and rabbit. The only gun he owned was a 12-gauge shotgun, single shot. He was reluctant, very reluctant, to let officers walk through his home. But they were able to convince him to see it because they wanted to see if Chris Regan was tied up somewhere in the house. Detectives talked again with the defendant on November 4th, 2014. They attempted to clarify whether she actually went by Chris's house to check on him on the 16th instead of the 15th, due to some text messages that she had sent him on the 15th as well as the 16th. Detectives contacted her again on December 18th. During this time, they questioned her on her whereabouts later in the afternoon of October 14th, 2014. They had already pulled the video surveillance from businesses on US 2 and had seen that Chris had been at the BP gas station around 4 p.m. They also saw her truck heading east past the Holiday gas station at 4:11 p.m. and again at 4:52 p.m., again heading east. The detective remembered her truck, indicating it was distinctive because it was missing a hubcap on the rear passenger side. This was later confirmed in the pictures taken by the FBI when they executed the search warrant on the truck in Indiana. They also asked her about going to Chris Regan's apartment on the 16th, and she said she only drove 5. However, the first Merritt Bank video showed someone who appeared to be her with similar tattoos coming from the direction of Chris Regan's apartment at 1:58 p.m., carrying something in her hand that may or may not have been a camera and walking east across the Jubilee Foods parking lot. During this interview, detectives discussed with her some discrepancies. In the trash in Chris Regan's apartment, there was no indication of anyone having eaten lasagna or garlic bread. Also, by this time, officers had reviewed phone records. Now she says she used Jason's phone, when previously said no, she didn't think so, because hers wasn't working correctly. This is different from what she told officers before, because before she was sharing Jason's phone because they needed to cut back on their finances. She also had a phone call from Jason's phone to Chris Regan's phone at a time when she was supposed to be with Chris. Why call Chris when she was actually with him? When asked again about being fearful of her husband, she said emphatically, "I'd never been scared of my husband a day in my life, and I've never hurt anyone in my life, and neither has he." You also heard from Detective Wes Smith from Michigan State Police and Anthony LaPlante from Escanaba Public Safety. These detectives performed extractions from Chris's computers, the Cochran's computer, and the defendant's iPhone. The defendant's iPhone and the Cochran's computer were perhaps the most revealing. The detective testified the phone extraction was able to pull text messages from the phone, but not all deleted messages could be recovered. A good portion of them, however, were recovered. Detective Smith also testified it appeared no further emails from Regan's account were sent after October 14th, 2014. Now, Detective J. Peterson. Sometimes there's testimony at trial that's given for legal purposes because we need to comply with the legal procedure. Sometimes there's information given at a trial to educate the jury, particularly when there may be an expectation that we may find fingerprints all the time, or that we should find fingerprints all the time. Detective J. Peterson testified regarding fingerprint evidence. He discussed all of the items that were processed and indicated the only one that had a latent print of comparison value were prints from the yellow sticky note, which ended up matching Chris Regan and Sergeant Barrett. He also testified, though, how common it is that they don't find prints and why they don't find prints in different cases. Detective Sergeant Randy Kahn also testified about cell towers, cellular networks, and mapping using cell phones. He was able to show us how the cell towers are divided into sectors and how a call can be mapped in one of the 3 sectors from the tower. He testified that yes, absolutely, the defendant's phone was working on October 14th and 15th, and showed us a graph of all of the text messages and voice calls going to and from her phone. Detective Kahn also showed us graphs showing the calls to and from Jason Cochran's phone on October 14th and October 15th, 2014. He testified that Jason Cochran's phone never had any communication with Chris Regan's phone from May of 2014 until October 13th, 2014. That the first communication between Jason's phone and Chris's phone occurred on October 14th, 2014. Detective Kahn was further able to show us how he mapped a Nilo's hit on Jason Cochran's phone on October 24th, 2014. And he testified that it was within a mile of where Chris Regan's remains had been found. Further mapping was done on Jason Cochran's Nilos records, which showed a trip from Ashland, Wisconsin, back to Iron River, to Menominee, and back to Iron River, starting at 9:37 p.m. on October 16th, and ending in Menominee at 3:28 a.m. on October 17th, with hits in Hancock and Houghton along the way at 1:58 a.m. Lastly, Detective Kahn testified about the mapping he did utilizing the GPS coordinates obtained by the FBI from the telematics unit of Chris Regan's car. He was able to adjust those coordinates to the proper time and was able to tell us that Chris Regan's car was near the Cochran house on October 14th at 5:25 p.m. Central Time. It was near Ice Lake and Lally Road at 8:17 p.m. Central Time, and at the park and ride in Bates Township where it remained, and was not started again at 8:27 p.m. Central Time on October 14th. Leslie Larson testified. She was the senior agent for the FBI's evidence response team. Her team came on board in August of 2015 and executed several search warrants, seizing a multitude of items. The first search warrant was served at the Cochran household, where a real rabbit's foot was found underneath the ramp going into the house. The real rabbit's foot was later identified by Terry O'Donnell as one that appeared similar to the one that Chris Regan habitually carried. Other items luminesced or tested positive for blood on presumptive tests. They were seized, packaged, and delivered to the laboratory at Quantico for testing. Agent Larson testified about various types of product they used on scene to see if there was blood or staining, and how different products gave different results, with some giving false positives because of interference by other materials such as iron, rust, mold. She testified about the suction dredge that the FBI did at the Caspian Pit, the search warrants in Indiana for major case prints, hairs, and the search of the truck. Several spots in the truck were swabbed and luminesced, but later did not test positive for blood or DNA. Other locations searched included a few places in Florence, Wisconsin, and a search using the digital evidence dog, all with no results. We learned from laboratory technicians that very few items in this case tested positive for blood. The crime scene in this case was scrubbed clean. Now, David Saylor, during that same time frame, testified that he met Jason Cochran at the end of September 2014. He testified that he would go over to Jason's nearly every day, or sometimes Jason would come over to his house, or his grandma's house at the time. He said that the defendant usually had the vehicle and Jason Cochran walked everywhere. David testified about some late night remodeling the Cochrans were doing at the end of October after Chris's disappearance between the hours of 11 a.m. and 3 a.m. He thought it was odd because during that time, neither the defendant nor Jason were working. There'd be no reason to be doing any remodeling in the middle of the night. He testified about the Cochrans' reaction and demeanor when the police were at their house on March 5th, 2015, executing a search warrant. He said that was the last time he saw them. The next day, the Cochrans were gone. He later learned they went back to Indiana. He said that he and his uncles told Jason Cochran while he was at their house that if the police were in his house, they were going to leave no stone unturned, and if there was something there, they would find it. He testified Jason Cochran got really quiet and super red in the face. He'd never seen him like that. He also said Jason Cochran told him the cops would be back, and Kelly, the defendant, gave them her mom's phone number and said if anything happened to them, to call her mom. His last piece of testimony was that he was afraid of the Cochrans, and if they didn't do something, then why leave town after the police searched their house? Carolyn Mayatek is the grandmother to David Saylor. She testified about how she met Jason Cochran sometime around October 14th, and that he would come over to see her boys. She said that she also met Jason and Kelly Cochran on her front porch later in October, and they were holding on to hands while on the porch. She testified that around the middle of October, she was awakened by something that could have been a firecracker or a gunshot, that she heard voices. She believed it was later in the night because she usually went to bed around 11 p.m. She also believed it was at the Cochran house near their ramp, and she heard a woman saying, "No, no," and a guy saying something like, "Let's get the hell out of here." And she saw a person climb into a car, back up down the street, and drive off. She testified that the voices didn't sound mad, just anxious. Now, Gary Wernholm was the neighbor who smelled that god-awful smell when the Cochrans were burning something in their burn barrel. He was sure it was around the middle of October 2014 because he was getting ready for hunting season. He said the defendant cut him off before he could make it around to the house to the backyard, but indicated that she would douse the fire. Gary also testified that he saw the defendant out in the front yard looking around on the ground with a flashlight the night of March 5th, 2015, after law enforcement executed the search warrant. The next day, the Cochrans were gone. Lisa Orovitz was the lab person who did the biology work in the crime scene processing for the Michigan State Police. They initially processed Chris Reagan's vehicle and his apartment, and after the Cochrans were identified as possible suspects, they executed a search warrant on March 5th, as well as March 27th, processing the Cochrans' house. She testified about the different ways they test for blood on the scene and items, again, that might result in a positive test or false positive test. They see ceiling tiles, a baseball bat, carpeting screws, hinges from the door, as well as a .22 revolver. The only thing that tested positive for blood once they arrived back at the lab was the metal plate on the baseball bat. Further testing revealed it was non-human blood. Paint scrapings from the tile and swabs from the steering wheel of the vehicle were sent to Grand Rapids for DNA analysis. The second search warrant yielded hairs, a red comforter with apparent stains from upstairs, a pillow, a tan cream comforter from the living room, and swabs of a stain from the east door trim and the basement floor. All of these items were sent to the Grand Rapids laboratory for DNA analysis. Blood was found on the red comforter from upstairs, and the area in the back inside door trim was also contained blood. At a later date, the laboratory also received a heavily damaged saw blade, as well as part of the wooden ramp, pieces of wood from the outside front door jamb, a door, and buckle swabs from the defendants. Saw blade tested negative for blood, as did all of the samples from the front door entrance. She said her team was also called out to process a scene on May 19th, 2016, where they collected several black trash bags and debris, a pair of eyeglasses, and 2 snuff cans for analysis. None of these items tested positive for blood, but the snuff can and eyeglasses were still swabbed and sent on to Grand Rapids for DNA testing. Chief Rizzo testified at the end of the first week in this trial. She talked about how the police officers connected the dots between the yellow sticky note with directions, the well-being check on Kelly Cochran, and the directions being directions to the defendant's home. She detailed for us how the Michigan State Police became involved early on in the investigation, the various search warrants, phone calls, records, and reviews that were done in an attempt to locate Chris Regan. She testified about the hours of videos that were pulled from businesses on US 2 and around Chris Regan's apartment, as well as the voluminous phone records and computer records that had to be reviewed for anything of evidentiary value. She testified about making calls and determining that Chris Regan never made it to North Carolina, nor did he make it to his drug test on October 15th. We heard about her interviews with the defendant and Jason Cochran on November 10th, 2014. She first took Jason Cochran in for the interview with instructions to the defendant to come down to the police station later. She interviewed the defendant shortly after speaking with the husband. The defendant talked about her husband being depressed and his physical disabilities, denied he was going to hurt her, and said he would never take me with him. When asked if she and Jason were separated, she told Chief Rizzo she would never leave him. She advised Chief Rizzo she continued to see other men even after he returned home from the hospital. She said the anger was gone when he came home from the hospital, but he was tired all the time. Chief Rizzo questioned her as to the last time she saw Chris alive. Again, it was over at his apartment, and she took him lasagna. Chief Rizzo testified she was suspicious about the lasagna because there was a big box in front of the stove, and the lasagna could not be cooked there without the box being moved. The defendant also said she heated garlic bread in a skillet on the stove that evening. The defendant was questioned about the dishes that were used that night and what was done with them, and she said she always washed and took her dishes back with her, and she always washed Chris's dishes. This was interesting to Chief Rizzo, as there was a sink full of dishes in Chris's apartment when officers were there. The defendant next changed her tune about Jason's phone. She went from, she doesn't think she would have used Jason's phone, to she was the one contacting Chris. And if his phone was used, it would have been her. When asked about going to Chris's apartment on the 15th, she gave the same statement she gave to the other detectives. That she went to check on Chris, that his vehicles were present, and she went in with the keys he gave her. During this interview, there was some discussion about the argument Chris Regan and the defendant had about people finding out about them at work. Same reason she gave on the stand. He was a professional and could get in trouble at work. He didn't want people to know about them at work. During this time, Chief Rizzo was also able to check text messages and cross-reference phone records and determined that Chris texted Kelly's phone around 3:57 p.m. on October 14th that she did not respond from her phone. That Jason's phone texted Chris Regan's phone at 4:11, and Chris Regan's phone texted Jason's phone back. Around 4:30, there's a 7-minute phone call when Chris Regan calls Jason Cochran's phone. The last text between the two is around 5:25 p.m. from Chris Regan's phone to Jason's phone. At the same time, his car is noted to be at the location in front of the Cochran's residence. During this interview, and there was actually one such call from Kelly Cochran's phone to Chris Regan's phone that night at 8:57 p.m. for a duration of 1 second. During this interview, Chief Rizzo asked the defendant how she felt about Chris Regan, and she said, "I loved him." Past tense. Chief Rizzo participated in various searches, including one of Chris Regan's vehicle where the stocking hat was seized. She retrieved Chris Regan's keys from the defendant. She seized a red folder, notebook, paperwork, and a floss pick from the apartment. She created a timeline of text and instant messages between the defendant's phone and other numbers of interest during the time defendant and Jason Cochran lived in Michigan. The text messages and their tone and content were testified to by Chief Rizzo, with Jason Cochran sounding almost desperate to spend time with his wife in September 2014, to Kelly and Jason exchanging "I love yous" repeatedly after Chris Regan was murdered on October 14th, 2014. During the search warrant that was executed on March 5th, 2015, the Cochran's computer was seized, and the defendant turned over a .22 revolver. No other guns were turned over, but a shotgun was found upstairs. No other guns were discussed or found during that search warrant. Additional phones were seized, including a track phone from the defendant and a track phone from Jason Cochran. And these track phones were track phones that the detectives were not able to get any information off from. Chief Rizzo continued to work the case and track down DNA from the military for a comparison sample. She also arranged for and had another search warrant executed on the house on March 27th. During this time, firearms ammunition was seized for not only the .22 pistol, but also a .30-06, 380 cartridges, 12-gauge shotgun shells, 12-gauge slugs, and Winchester .25 ammunition. Again, no other guns were located other than the .22 revolver and the 12-gauge shotgun. However, the defendant testified that the magazine tube had been in the house the whole time and wasn't taken to the pit until after detectives left the house. During this search warrant, the notebook about monsters was found and seized in the basement. This is the notebook that Chief Rizzo read to you, that appeared to be outlines of chapters and talked about hunters, predators, monsters, and prey, described by the defendant as being an autobiographical notebook, and the same notebook where it says the wife saves the day. Starting in March and April 2015, law enforcement began to conduct ground searches of areas of interest related to the case. Dogs and people tramped through the woods near the park and ride, Wildwood Lake, Caspian Pit, and around and behind the Cochran home. In April of 2015, Chief Rizzo contacted Kelly and Jason Cochran in an attempt to obtain their DNA. During that telephone conversation with the defendant, Chief Rizzo tells her the case has been changed from a missing person case to a homicide case. A canine was utilized to search the defendant's home, where it hit by the wooden planks on the back patio in the garage. The dogs were later taken to the Caspian Pit, where a search was conducted on the water, and the canine hit on the water. A dive of the Caspian Pit turned up a burn barrel with a piece of rope attached, as well as a cement block. During this time, Chief Rizzo and Michael Niger also excavated the Cochran's fire pit from their backyard. The fire pit revealed a saw blade, as well as grommets and a zipper from an old Navy pair of jeans. When the defendant was asked whether Chris Regan wore Old Navy clothes, she said, "No, I don't think so." However, Michigan State Police photographs from their search warrant in the Regan apartment show an Old Navy shirt clearly depicted hanging by Chris Regan's closet door. No reciprocating saw was ever found at the Cochran household on Lawrence Street. David Saylor testified one was given to him, but he gave it back because it required power, and he had no power in his residence to run the saw. In July of 2015, Chief Rizzo made arrangements with Hobart PD and Lake County Sheriff's Office to take the DNA from the defendant and Jason Cochran. During this meeting, Chief Rizzo was able to verify that Jason Cochran was the author of the monster notebook. Chief Rizzo also participated in the execution of search warrants on Cochran's home by the FBI, the interview of defendant's brother Colton Gaboyan and his girlfriend Barbara Dunn in September of 2015, and execution of search warrants by the FBI in the fall, November of 2015. On February 22nd, 2016, Chief Rizzo learned that Jason Cochran passed away in Indiana. Detective Jeremy Ogden from Hobart PD came on board and offered support to Iron River Police Department for their investigation. Chief Rizzo sent copies of Iron River Police Department's entire case file to date to Detective Ogden for his review. On March 23, 2016, Detective Ogden came to Iron River to look over the various locations identified in the case file. On March 29, 2016, Chief Rizzo receives a phone call from Detective Ogden, who tells her that the defendant told the detective that Jason shot Chris, and Chris died quickly. He told her he was en route with the defendant because she was going to show him where Chris Reagan's remains were dumped. When the detective and the defendant arrived in Iron River around 7 a.m., they went to the police department first. While there, the defendant indicated she wanted to talk with Chief Rizzo. During that meeting, she tells Chief Rizzo that she needed to leave her alone after this, that the defendant didn't kill anyone, she didn't steal anyone's car, that Jason told her where to find Chris, and she wanted a letter of immunity before she would do anything. Everyone left the police department, they got the immunity thing straightened out, and they followed the defendant to Pintoga Trail, where she directed the detectives to a location that was fairly close to US 2. She indicated the bags with Chris's body were put in the woods about 8 to 10 feet from the road. Law enforcement started looking in the area as directed by the defendant. Eventually, the defendant and Detective Ogden left the area and went to her house where a reenactment was performed. Chief Rizzo and other officers continued to search the area and brought in the FBI, as well as canines. The search was hampered by snow on the ground the second day, and nothing was located during the search. Despite this being the area the defendant directed them to, Chief Rizzo testified that she thought it was an unlikely place for the remains, considering how open it was in that area. On April 7th, 2016, the defendant calls Chief Rizzo. This is a long phone call with Chief Rizzo that was initiated by the defendant, and she is starting to, I guess, become more friendly with Chief Rizzo at this time. During this phone call, she tells Chief Rizzo that Jason's an excellent shot. Chris went quickly. The bullet was still in Chris's skull. Jason shot at her and she buried 2 casings in the basement floor. Jason drilled out the barrel of the .22 rifle prior to throwing it in the Caspian pit. She didn't kill Chris. Jason killed Chris to hurt her. She was involved with 3 men at once. That Chris had been at her house 2 times before. Jason was supposed to be gone when Chris came over. That Chris arrived between 5:30 and 6:30 and never made it further than the east entrance where he was shot in the head. She said they both fell down the stairs. That Jason made her try and dig the bullet out. That Jason dragged Chris into the basement by the washer and dryer. That she got the cord for the sawzall off the shelf so he could cut Chris up. Jason heard her and Chris having sex while he was in the basement. She said she got sick in the pan of hamburgers and Jason threw the pan. That he ate the lasagna instead. That Jason wanted to put Chris into acid, but she convinced him not to. It would require 6 to 7 gallons. People would notice if she bought that much acid, and the fumes alone would kill them. She said Jason cut up Chris with a sawzall. That he drove Chris's car to the parking lot without gloves, and he was wearing a dark-colored stocking hat. She said she never drove Chris's car before. Doesn't know why she lied about that. She said Jason put Chris in 10 to 15 black garbage bags, and that the oldest homicide Jason committed was 11 years ago, with most recent being 2 years. She said he went into the woods with the bags and came back with the empty bags. She couldn't report it to law enforcement because she knew that Jason would kill her. She said Jason told her to text Chris on October 15th and 16th to make it look like she didn't know something happened to him. She doesn't know why she used Jason's phone to do that. She's 100% positive Chris's remains were on Pintoga Trail. She said that she went to the apartment on the 15th for her wedding ring, and that she did not take Chris's Percocets. She said that she went to Iron Mountain to Walmart on October 15th, that she cleaned the basement for 24 hours straight with bleach, ammonia, sandpaper, there's the solid, and brushes. Chief Rizzo testified that the defendant called her again on April 11, 2016. During this phone call, she indicated she was confident about the location for Chris's remains. She also said that Jason had a lot of kills and kept trophies in a Crown Royal bag. She put the bag on Pantoga Trail a week before Chris was killed, in the ground under a 12 by 18 metal plate. That the Sawzall went to David Saylor. That the clothes were maybe in the garbage, Chris's clothes. That no one but her knows the truth. That Jason always forgave her. She said that she carried the barrel of the gun in her pant leg to the Caspian pit, and that she knows she has to convince a jury she was scared to death of Jason. She said she bought the plate that covered the Crown Royal bag at Ace Hardware, and that Jason never threatened to kill her, but she believed he would kill her for that type of betrayal. A few days after this call, Chief Rizzo received 2 shirts in the mail from Hobart Police Department, a pink tank top and a blue shirt. Defendant claimed she wore the pink tank top during the killing and cleanup of Chris Regan, and that Jason Cochran wore the blue t-shirt. On April 23rd, she received yet another phone call from the defendant. During this call, there was a lot of discussion about the remains of Chris Regan and where he was at on Pantoga Trail. Chief Rizzo had been up and down by this time, Pantoga Trail, and had not found anything other than some random bones, which later turned out to be non-human. During this call, Chief Rizzo testified that the defendant also told her she believed that Chris Regan had his glasses on him. Chief Rizzo testified that on May 16, 2016, the defendant was arraigned in Niagara County courtroom. That she was asked at that time if she'd be willing to show officers where Chris was located. She indicated she would think about it. Later that evening, around 8 p.m., Chief Rizzo testified she received a phone call from the jail. The defendant was requesting Chief Rizzo come and talk to her that evening. Chief Rizzo did go to the jail that night and spoke with the defendant. The defendant, now remember, this was after she had told Detective Ogden in Kentucky about the marriage pact, that she and Jason planned the murder, that his plan actually wouldn't work and she had to fix it, that she invited Chris over and she knew Chris was going to be killed, that she was supposed to kick Chris down the stairs and that she couldn't do it, and that she was a serial killer. So Chief Rizzo goes to the jail May 16th knowing all of that. On May 16th, the defendant tells Chief Rizzo that she'd had homicidal thoughts her entire life, that she doesn't know if it will ever go away, that she was trying to protect her family from the details of what she had done, that she did have a plan to kill one of the COs in Kentucky, one of the corrections officers, but the girl was nice, so she hurt herself with the shanks instead. She said she has a good side and a bad side, but she chooses the bad side. She doesn't feel remorseful after she kills. She said she would go with Laura to look for Chris and to the Caspian pit. When asked about why Chris and not Eric, she said it was supposed to be both. She wanted to make a statement to officers regarding the other homicides. The next day, on May 17, 2016, Chief Rizzo and the defendant, along with other officers, go on a field trip. The defendant takes them to this tree and says this is where Chris was dumped. The tree had been standing at the time Chris Regan's remains were dumped. However, she still recognized it even a year and a half later, after the tree had fallen down. She next takes them to Wildwood Lake and says she went in to get the camera from Chris's apartment because of sexual pictures on it and threw it into the lake. She takes them to her home and she shows them in the basement where Jason cut up Chris. They then go upstairs and she walks by the counter and says, "Yep, those are the forceps." She directs the officer where to locate the magazine to. During this trip, she also takes the officers to the Caspian pit and shows them where the gun was thrown. She was eventually taken back to jail. During this time, while on the field trip, she tells Chief Rizzo that Jason didn't collect trophies. She did. And that the trophy bag was hers and should be right next to where Chris Regan's remains were put. Chief Rizzo also testified that they talked about butterflies because she noticed Kelly Cochran's tattoos. And Kelly indicated that the reason she likes butterflies is because they are attracted to and land on dead bodies. Chief Rizzo testified that she and Alyssa Palmer decided to make one more run with the dog out near the tree identified by the defendant that evening. Chief Rizzo said that they were following a deer track to the northeast of the tree when Gila, the dog, took off barking and ran across an open field that was about 50 yards away. Chief Rizzo testified that as she approached the field where the dog was sitting, that she saw a human skull. Chief Rizzo testified that she called for an evidence technician and the skull was packaged and the location was marked. That additional searches for remains were conducted throughout May 19th and 20th. That a pair of eyeglasses were found near the tree, as well as 2 snuff cans and additional black bags. Chief Rizzo testified about the dive team coming to search the pit in Wildwood Lake, and that an additional field trip was taken about a week later or so, looking for the trinket bag, which the defendant now says was moved, as well as Chris Regan's cell phone. On that field trip, the defendant took officers to the Brule River on M189 in Ottawa Lake with negative results. Following the finding of the skull and the other items, Chief Rizzo testified she arranged to get dental records for Chris Regan and sent other items to the lab for analysis. The dental records were eventually forwarded to Dr. Filippi for review and the skull to Nevis for examination by a forensic anthropologist. Chief Rizzo testified the defendant indicated she was the one who drove Jason Cochran and the remains to that location, that Jason carried the remains and Jason bagged up the remains. She further told Chief Rizzo that she went into the apartment for both the wedding ring and the camera, but would not admit to taking anything else. She also told Chief Rizzo that once Chris Regan let her use his keys to get into the apartment early to make him dinner, and that she made a copy of the keys at Ace Hardware without his knowledge. Chief Rizzo testified his watch, wallet, car keys, phone, and necklace are still missing to this day, actually as well as the rest of Chris Regan. During Chief Rizzo's testimony, the other laboratory reports from the FBI were admitted, and none of the other bones that were found were human. Adam Schiavo and Brent Benson testified about their role as evidence technicians, photographing the scenes and collecting evidence. Trooper Hessling testified about the finding of the barrel of the gun in the pit and the technique the divers used to find the barrel. He also testified they could not or did not find the trigger assembly or the camera in Wildwood Lake. Dr. Yarger, the Iron County medical examiner, testified he took the skull and took panoramic dental x-rays of it to send to Dr. Filippi. He further testified the skull was sent out to Dr. Filippi and John Cervello, and after receiving the reports, he determined the cause of death for Christopher Crowell Regan was death by gunshot wound to the head, and that the manner of death was homicide. Dr. Filippi testified about the process he went through to match Chris Regan's dental records to the skull, and that he found the skull matched the dental records and identified it as Christopher Crowell Regan. Tim Gaboyan and Melanie Gaboyan, the defendant's parents, testified as well. They obviously love their daughter. Tim Gaboyan testified his daughter was a strong woman, and that she and Jason had verbal arguments, but he never saw them have a physical fight. He also testified that the weekend they were in Michigan, and in September 2014, there was disagreement between the defendant and Jason, where Jason popped his mouth off and the defendant told him to grow up. Melanie Gaboyan testified as well, and it was painful for all of us to watch. Mrs. Gaboyan testified about how often they saw Jason and the defendant, about the pool business and defendant taking care of the sales and the bookkeeping, and sometimes the grunt work when Jason Cochran's back became too bad to do so. That the defendant and Jason came back to Indiana after the police searched their house. That Jason Cochran was moody when he came back and quiet. That Kelly was the worker of the two because of Jason's back. Mrs. Gaboyan also testified that they had guns and that both defendant and Jason had gone to the shooting range before. When asked about the trip to Michigan, she said Jason was very quiet while they were there. She further testified that she'd never seen him out of control. She testified the defendant was educated and that Jason was going to school, and the defendant's degree was in psychology, and both of them, she and Jason, had taken forensics class. She indicated she never saw Jason and the defendant fight even after they came back from Indiana and were living with them. That Jason's nickname was Uncle Quack Quack, and both were familiar with the use of power tools. Defendant's mother advised the defendant had used drugs ever since she was a teenager, and that she had tried to get her help, tried to get her to go to rehab, but she was unsuccessful. During Mrs. Gaboyan's testimony, a jail phone call was played that occurred between her and the defendant from May 21st to 2016. During this phone call, the defendant says to her, "Didn't you see this coming?" And her mother responds, "Well, after." Her mother asked her if she had a conscience, and she responds, "What do you think?" And her mom said, "I don't think you do." The defendant tells her, "I've always been like this, Mom. I've always been the same. I was molested, but it didn't make me who I am. I was already who I was." Her mother told her, if you remember, that she would have gotten her help a long time ago if the defendant had told her she was having these kinds of thoughts about killing people or hurting them. The defendant tells her that she tried to tell people when she was a teenager, but wasn't able to get any help. When asked by the prosecution, her mother admitted that not once did the defendant in that phone call ever place blame for her behavior or her homicidal tendencies on an abusive husband. You heard from Walt Ammerman. He's a friend of Jason Cochran and the defendant. He met them playing Battle Pirates on Facebook, would visit with them occasionally over the few years that he knew them, but he mainly knew Jason Cochran and talked with him almost every night, either on Facebook or via phone. Walt knew the defendant, but didn't spend as much time because she worked. He contacted the FBI shortly after Jason Cochran's death, and after he spoke with the FBI, he was contacted by Hobart Detective Jeremy Ogden. Detective Ogden discussed this idea he had for him to be a confidential source and record a phone call with the defendant. The plan was for Ammerman to say that he had received a letter from Jason Cochran containing an unopened letter and a note stating if anything were to happen to him, that the letter inside should be sent to the Iron River Police Department and do not open it. Walt testified he was nervous and agreed to do the call. He made the call to the defendant. She can be heard saying on the phone, "Don't, please." She can be heard crying. And then, "Are you serious? Are you fucking with me?" She does then, after a few minutes, say, "Well, do what you gotta do." Walt and the defendant continued to maintain contact after the letter call. Walt testified he told the defendant that he mailed the letter without looking at it. Walt also testified he did not know anything about Chris Reagan's disappearance, that Jason and Kelly had always denied that they had anything to do with it. You heard testimony from the DNA analysts in this matter, Lisa Champion as well as Tiffany Smith. And Lisa Champion testified first and talked about DNA and how it can be degraded by moisture, fire, being out in the elements. And ultimately, very few items in this case had DNA on them. We know that the steering wheel had a mixture of Chris's DNA and someone else's, that the stocking hat had a mixture of Chris's DNA and Kelly Cochran's DNA, that a red comforter found upstairs in the home had the defendant's DNA on it, and a bloodstain by the back door of the Cochran household had Jason's DNA on it. We heard that the glasses and the snuff cans had no DNA, and the shirts did not have any DNA inconsistent with either Kelly Cochran or Jason Cochran. The only positive DNA hit for Chris Regan, other than the steering wheel and the stocking cap, was the forceps that the defendant said she used to attempt to dig the bullet out of Chris Regan's skull. We heard from Detective Sergeant Butt, who testified that the bullet found near the skull, under the topsoil, did not match the ballistics of either the .22 long rifle or the .22 revolver, despite the fact that it was a .22 caliber bullet. FBI agents Jay Johnson and Mark Hoff testified about their discussions with the defendant and Jason Cochran in Indiana on November 12, 2015. During those interviews, Agent Johnston threw out 3 possible scenarios for the defendant considered. He further told the defendant and her husband that blood was found in their house and items were sent to the lab for testing, that he expected an arrest warrant would be forthcoming. He asked the defendant why Chris Regan's blood would be in her truck, and she said he cut himself on moss when they were hiking. Ed Jackson from Graves County, Kentucky Jail testified about the circumstances surrounding finding the shanks in the defendant's cell. And Michael Niger testified about the various items he found during the searches and the 3 photos he found on the defendant's computer of the Caspian pit that were viewed or downloaded on October 8, 2014, with one of those photos being a zoomed-in portion of the pit where the gun was found. Detective Sergeant Bruno showed us 3 renderings of a crime scene he prepared, showing the defendant and Chris Regan and the positions they were in based on the testimony up until that point in the case. This is when Chief Rizzo found the skull on the 17th. These are shanks from the Graves County, Kentucky Jail. This is the rendering that Sergeant Bruno prepared. Jeremy Ogden testified last for the prosecution in this case, or very nearly last. Right after Jason Cochran died, Detective Ogden became involved in the case. He testified he first met with the defendant on February 29th at the Hobart Police Department in Indiana. During this interview, she tells him about Chris and Eric, and reluctantly tells him about Jessica. During this interview, she said she probably would not return to Michigan and expressed anger with Michigan authorities over the investigation into her and her husband. Detective Ogden indicated he first introduced the subject of helping to find Chris's remains to her during this interview. He was attempting to build a rapport with her and talk with her about the witness versus suspect concept, that she needed to get out ahead of this situation before the police came knocking on her door. During the interview, the defendant tells Detective Ogden she is self-sufficient, she doesn't need anyone. She tells him when it appears that he's beating around the bush about something to just say it how it is, and I have more respect for you. Detective Ogden seizes on that statement and realizes that is the key to having communication with the defendant. He asked her how she would feel if someone hurt one of her family members and talked with her about bringing Chris Regan home, how important it was to his family that they have resolution. The defendant, during the course of this interview, he also gives her an out during this discussion by telling her whatever happened, Jason's gone now, and she could get out of it without hurting Jason, and she could bring closure to his family. She tells Detective Ogden that Jason was a kind and caring person. And at this point in time, Detective Ogden tells her that people who go through something like she and Jason did with this investigation are bonded forever. Detective Ogden testified that he next met with her on March 4th, 2016 in Culver's. He again talked with her about an out and discussed her coming to Michigan to help locate Chris's remains. Her response was, "I think you think I know more than I know." His response was, "Don't lie to me if you respect me." She continued to tell the detective during this interview that Jason was a good guy. Detective Ogden gave her a scenario where she was a witness to something bad happening between Jason and Chris. He didn't get too specific, and told her a witness is someone who voluntarily comes forward where a suspect has the police knocking on their door. He testified that she chose this scenario, at least in the first few statements that she gave about Chris Regan's death. Sometime between February 22nd, 2016 and March 12th, 2016, Detective Ogden indicates he becomes aware of Walt Emmerman's existence and devises a plan to use the fake letter to move the defendant along. He doesn't know if it's going to work, but it's worth a shot. He and Walt met on March 4th, 2016, and the letter call took place on March 12th, 2016. He testified the defendant called him 2 days later on March 14th. During this call, she informed him a letter had been forwarded to the Iron River Police Department, that Jason had written it, and she told him about her discussion with Walt Emmerman. During this call, she told Detective Ogden, when he asked if she would help find Chris Regan, that she didn't know if she would be needed. Detective Ogden asked her if the letter would reveal all that he needed to know. Do you think it will disclose the location of Chris Regan? The defendant's response was very telling. I don't think he knows. Referring to Jason Cochran not knowing the location of Chris Regan. Detective Ogden again talks about bringing her to Michigan to find Chris Regan, and her response was that work was more important at that moment. He asked her if she really thought something else was going to happen, such as something else be disclosed, and she said, I do. Detective Ogden tried to talk to her again at this point about being the hero of the story, a variation on the witness versus suspect theme. On March 22nd, 2016, the detective testified he witnessed her go to this park and sit by a particular tree on several occasions. He then went to the tree where she sat and carved Chris is here, and also carved Regan on a different tree. Again, he didn't know if it would have any response, but maybe. He testified he saw her on March 29th go into that park, and as he drove around to the other side of the lake to attempt to watch her, that before he got around to the other side of the lake, she was walking or running out of the woods very quickly. He said that he then went to meet with Chet Cochran, the defendant's brother-in-law, and the defendant started blowing up his phone that day while he was there, insisting on meeting with him that day and wanting to talk. Ogden testified he proceeded to Veterans Park where he found the defendant asleep in her vehicle. He couldn't rouse her, so he called an ambulance. They cleared her medically, and he talked with her in the truck for a while, then in the restaurant, then in the parking lot again, where she told him that Jason shot Chris, and Chris died quickly. He hustled her to the police station where he took a statement from her, and she agreed to go with him and Detective Sykes to Michigan to find Chris. Detective Ogden indicated that she slept most of the way to Michigan, but upon coming close to Iron County, requested this letter of immunity before she would show the location. Ogden testified he told her, you know that's not happening, I will turn this car right around and drive back to Indiana. She conceded, and they continued their journey. Upon arrival at Iron River PD, She goes to the interview room and talks with Chief Rizzo and yells at her. Then they proceed to Pintoga Trail. After the letter call, Kelly Cochran's story changed from never being afraid of her husband a day in her life to being a victim of his abusive behavior. After the letter call, Kelly Cochran comes forward with knowledge about Chris's remains and that Jason shot Chris. She told Detective Ogden that Chris was shot in the back of the head and that she saw it happen, that Chris was coming over to her home, and that she didn't know that Jason Cochran was waiting for them. She said that Chris was shot in the back of the head upstairs in her bedroom while she and Chris were having sex. That was the statement on the 29th. On the 30th, during the reenactment, she tells Detective Ogden that she lied about being upstairs and having sex when Chris was shot, and that Jason was actually waiting for Chris in the basement. That she thought Jason was gone, and that she and Chris fell down the stairs. Chris died immediately, and that Jason pointed a gun at her while in the basement and fired 2 rounds. That he demanded she dig the bullet out of Chris's head with a pair of forceps. She then said they took Chris's car to the parking lot in Bates Township and returned home. She gave him the cord for the Zaza, and he began cutting Chris up in pieces and putting him in black garbage bags. She said she refused to carry the garbage bags up the stairs, so Jason did it himself and put them in the back of the truck. She said she drove the truck to Pintoga Trail, where Jason dumped pieces of Chris Regan into the woods on the side of the road. She told Ogden she picked the location for the car, as well as the body, and said that she thought that he brought garbage bags back to the truck where they were disposed of in the trash. She said once she returned home, Cochran demanded she cook him dinner and clean up the blood that covered the basement floor. On the way back to Indiana, on the 30th, she tells the detective that Jason Cochran killed others. Detective Ogden testified that after this trip, the defendant starts jerking his chain a little bit. She called him on several occasions, indicating she was at a site where Jason put a body and that he needed to go there and find the body. He next met with her on April 1st, 2016. She called him at the Lake Park, or she met him at the Lake Park restaurant. During this meeting, she tells him she has additional details, and they leave and go to the Hobart Police Department. This is a lengthy interview between the two of them. Detective Ogden asked her to start the beginning on October 14th and tell him everything she remembered about that date. She said Chris was coming over for a present and sex, that she cooked dinner 5 to 6 times a night, or 5 to 6 nights a week. They were having lasagna. Jason was at Matt's house, with David, and they were going to the spa. She texted Chris from Jason's phone to invite him over and told him her phone wasn't working for a couple of days, that she was blowing Chris off. She said she started off by giving him a blowjob at the back door, then had sex with him, then finished up. And at this point, she says Chris started up the stairs ahead of her while she closed the door. But she was in the line of fire, if you recall the video, if she closed the door behind Chris. She must have realized that because eventually she changes it to she was against the wall having sex with him at the time he was shot. She was wearing a pink tank top. He was wearing jeans and striped shirt, no coat. The temperature was around 40 degrees. She told Chris that she had been in Indiana the weekend before, but that was a lie. Ogden testified that he confronted her about who was in control between her and Jason, and she told Ogden that Jason was. Ogden said, "That's not accurate." That she would text Jason telling him she wanted dinner at 4:30 p.m. when she got off work, and then when she didn't show up for dinner at the appointed time, Jason would start texting her, asking her where she was, when she was coming home for dinner. And at that time, she was at Chris's apartment with Chris, standing Jason up and making him dance to her tune. She said they both tumbled down the stairs. Chris wasn't breathing and his eyes were open. Jason had a .22 long rifle. She doesn't know why she lied about Chris being shot upstairs. He confronted her about the likelihood of someone falling backwards when shot in the back of the head. She said she was terrified of Jason during this time and that she didn't care if Jason shot her, she didn't want to live. So she got a big gash on her head and put 3 stitches in it. Ogden indicates he actually got up to look at her head but didn't see anything. He testified, she said the lump on her head, a year and a half later, was from the fall down the stairs. And she indicated a lump on her forehead. Ogden said he confronted her about that and said if that were true, your face would be all black and blue and someone would have seen you like that. Ogden asked her, "What did you say at the bottom of the stairs after Chris was shot? Did you say something like, 'Oh my God, don't shoot me'?" And she said, no, I'm not that kind of person. Defendant told Detective Ogden during this interview that Jason made mistakes and she is smarter than him. He started the car with his finger, and she had to tell him to wear the hat in the car. That if hair was in the car, she would say that she carried it into Chris's car on her clothing. Ogden testified she told him she wore the same clothes to clean up the blood and still had the clothes, pink tank top. She wasn't sure if she had Jason's shirt. Ogden testified defendant told him Jason had not cut up Chris yet when she got sick in the pan, and the first thing that she did was stitch herself up, which took about half an hour. She said the sex took about 30 minutes. At this point, Detective Ogden confronted her. You have a jealous, abusive husband watching his wife have sex with another man for 30 minutes, and he doesn't shoot him during sex. Ogden asked for specific positioning, and now she says Chris's back was against the wall while she was giving him a blowjob. Then she turned and faced the wall while he entered her from behind. Again, Detective Ogden says, and he didn't shoot you while you were having sex. Nope. She said that Jason went back downstairs after eating and started downsizing Chris. When she went down there, she sees blood everywhere. He stops cutting up Chris, and they decide to deal with the car. She thinks it was around 10 when they took the car. She said no plastic was used for the basement floor. Then she took some pills and rolled a joint, and Jason came upstairs and smoked the joint with her. They took the car. Jason wore flannel over his bloody clothes and changed his shoes before taking it. She also told Detective Ogden she wasn't sure if the trunk had been opened by Jason or not because there was some discussion about whether to put Chris in the trunk. Detective Ogden testified that when they got back from dropping the car off, that she told them that Jason went back downstairs to finish cutting up Chris. She picked the location for Chris's body, but refused to help Jason carry him upstairs and load him in the truck. That Jason got in her face at that point by the electrical box, calling her names, and Ogden asked her, why didn't you go get your .22 revolver during this time frame? Her response was, he would have taken the gun out from me. She also said she couldn't kill Jason, easier said than done, and admitted to taking steps to avoid Jason getting caught, and that she wanted to save Jason. Ogden confronts her about not driving to the police station or helping Jason unload the bags. She says without a doubt she is the one who's more capable. She tells Ogden during this interview that she's leaving out details. She doesn't use the word insurance. She says she's leaving out details because she wants to make sure she is all right. Detective Ogden testified that she told him after they got home from dropping off Chris's remains, they had sex and they went to sleep, and that she cleaned up the next day. She told him that Jason would not go to Iron Mountain without her, but she didn't recall going to Walmart or to Peking for Chinese food. She said she wouldn't let him take the truck. On the 15th, she told Detective Ogden she cleaned the whole day. She never brought up driving past the remains or going to Chris's apartment like she previously told other officers. She then changed her story and said she did drive by Chris's remains on the 15th. Or it could have been the 16th. She doesn't recall because she drove by there a bunch of times. Detective Ogden testified he asked her where they were the night of the 16th and the 17th. Were they in Ashland, Menominee? She had no good reason for what they were doing, but said that Jason wouldn't go by himself. Ogden testified he confronted her again about why Chris would need directions that night. And she said he could make his way back to his car as a hiker and he didn't have any problems with directions. She said that she lied about both cars being at the apartment on the 15th, that she went to there to get her wedding ring, and then when asked by Detective Ogden, she said she did not cry at the apartment. She said Jason got rid of Chris's car keys, she doesn't know where they went, that he gave the Sawzall to David Saylor, who gave it back, and they then tossed the Sawzall. Detective Ogden testified that she said her relationship with Chris lasted 6 months, and that she broke off her relationship with Eric a couple of weeks prior to Chris dying. April 26th was Chris Regan's birthday. The defendant talked with both Chief Rizzo and Detective Ogden on that date, told Detective Ogden that there were others that Jason had killed. During the call with Chief Rizzo, she told Chief Rizzo that Jason Cochran had trophies and that she took them and buried them in that location right next to Chris's body. She told Chief Rizzo she buried them a week before they dumped Chris's body there. And when Chief Rizzo asked her how Jason Cochran knew where to dump the body, so that it was by the trophy bag, because she had previously said Jason Cochran didn't know that she buried the trophy bag there. She told Chief Rizzo that she drove Jason Cochran specifically to that spot and pointed out where to dump the body. Ogden testified that she told him on April 26th that she took the camera from Chris's apartment and threw it in Wildwood Lake because of the pictures. She then tells Detective Ogden, this is something she tells Detective Ogden for the first time. He confronts her about it and asks her if she was using it for insurance purposes, and she said she just forgot. She also told Detective Ogden now that they took the car first, cut him up later, and she wasn't sure who picked Park and Ride, but that she got the cord from the shop for the Sawzall sale. On April 27th and 28th, Detective Ogden received weird texts from the defendant that make him believe she's leaving Indiana. He continues to text her in the hopes that she'd turn her phone on and off and it could be pinged. On April 28th, the warrant for Kelly Cochran's arrest is issued by Iron County, and they're successful in pinging her phone. She's arrested by U.S. Marshals in Kentucky at a Cochran family member's home. Late on April 28, 2016, Detective Ogden and Steve Houck receive a call from the Graves County, Kentucky jail. The defendant wants to give a statement. Detectives drive all night and arrive at the jail to take her statement. During a lengthy interview on April 30, 2016, defendant tells detectives that she and Jason planned to kill Chris Regan. That Jason was going to go over to Chris's apartment October 13, 2014 and kill him, but that she stopped him because she knew he would never get away with it. She told detectives that she invited Chris or lured him to her house for this murder to be carried out. That she knew that Chris's death wasn't her choice, but that she knew Chris was going to die that night. She testified to she told Detective Ogden that Chris had never been to her house before October 14th. That was his first time there, and his last time there. She said the plan was for her to originally kill Chris Regan by kicking him or pushing him down the basement stairs. That was part of their pact that they made. It was her responsibility. Well, she couldn't do it. She knew Jason was waiting with the .22 and he would do it. During the same interview on April 30th, 2016 in Kentucky, the defendant tells the detective that she has killed before numerous times and that she doesn't count Chris Regan as her kill because Jason was the one who had to do it. It was Jason's kill. She gives some information to detectives about additional victims. And during this interview tells detectives that she and Jason had a murder pact that was made on their wedding night. If one of them were to cheat, then they had to kill the person they were to cheat with, or the other spouse would kill them. Now, defendant's testimony was lengthy, and defendant knew when she got up on the stand that she was going to have to come up with a plausible explanation for you as to why she would say she participated in the killing of Chris Regan. Why the murder pact? Why say she's a serial killer? So her approach, if you recall, was, I'm a liar, but I'm not a murderer. I lied about this and I lied about that, so I also lied about killing Chris Regan. I also lied about the murder pact, and I also lied about being a serial killer, and I also lied about my participation in Chris's death. Her reasoning didn't make sense. She said she felt guilty about Jason shooting Chris. Therefore, she had to make up a bunch of lies so people would believe that she was this terrible, awful person. She wanted people to believe she was a horrible person. Anyone hearing the story, before she said that she participated in killing, before she said that she was a murderer, before she said that she was a serial killer, before she said that they had this murder pact, would have already thought she was an awful person. She had numerous affairs. She drove her husband to the brink of suicide, and she drove him to killing her lover. What she told detectives is that she wanted to protect her parents. And that the reason that she told these other details where she made herself to be the least culpable party was because she wanted to protect them. Protecting them, and this is interesting, she feels guilty. She wants to protect her parents. And protecting them would include not telling them you're a serial killer, not telling them you're a murderer, not telling them you've had homicidal thoughts your entire life, not telling them you helped your husband cover up a crime or participated in a killing. In Kentucky, her back was against the wall. She was in jail facing murder charges, and this was going to end one of three ways. She's going to be in jail for a long time, she's going to murder a guard or some other person while she's in jail, or she's going to commit suicide while she's in jail. Remember, at this time, the guards had not yet found her shanks. She talks to Detective Ogden on April 30th. The shanks were found on May 5th. She had nothing to lose by revealing her true colors to Detective Ogden. She knew she had the Shanks as a backup plan. Now remember, Kelly Cochran told Chief Rizzo she does not do anything on impulse. She thinks everything through. She wasn't drugged up when she was talking with Detective Ogden that day, so she can't use that as an excuse. She was serious as a heart attack when talking with him. You saw her demeanor. She talked about Jason Cochran being absolutely chilling while eating lasagna right after killing Chris. She was absolutely chilling in that video, telling Detective Ogden about her part in the plan and their marriage pact. She's a fast thinker, I'll give you that. She used Jason Cochran in the end. He was her excuse, he was her fall guy, she was the victim. They planned that according to her letter to her parents. Jason was always going to be the fall guy. He was abusive. It was his phone. He drove the car. He shot him. He cut him up. He carried the bags. He did this and he did that. And she tells her mom in her letter and her dad that she's tired of playing the victim, that she was going to do it all the way through trial, but that, she changed her mind. What the defendant cannot deny in this case is her own words. Prosecution didn't come in here and put words in her mouth. Defendant's words speak volumes to you. They are the most recent thing in your memory and the most recent thing in this trial. Defendant's demeanor also speaks volumes. Where was the guilt-stricken, love-struck, abused woman during this investigation? Where was she during this trial? The judge is going to give you an instruction that people do not have to prove motive for this crime. But here's the motive. The wedding pact. Jason's motive was he was a jealous husband. This was their agreement. It was his husbandly right to kill Chris if she did not do it herself. Kelly's motive was twofold. She knew Jason was going to kill Chris, and Jason was going to get caught along with her. If she didn't help Jason, she was not only losing Chris, but she was losing Jason too. She also was a woman scorned. She knew in her heart of hearts that this man, Christopher Reagan, did not love her. He would spend time with her. He would use her for sex, but she was not his type. His type was blonde, classy, and elegant. He wouldn't be seen with her around town, and he was furious with her that people found out about their relationship. Ultimately, he was using her for sex and leaving her behind with Jason Cochran when he went to North Carolina. That enraged the defendant, and that was one more reason to participate in Chris's killing. This killing was also a crime of opportunity. Who would notice Chris gone right away? He was leaving to go to North Carolina. He was somewhat of a loner. Ladies and gentlemen, Kelly and Jason Cochran were bonded in blood. When normal people made a wedding vow and committed to loving each other, they committed to killing for each other. In this case, the defendant is charged with open murder. And open murder means that the jury gets to choose between the appropriate murder charge, whether it should be premeditated murder that she'd be found guilty of, whether it be second-degree murder that she'd be found guilty of, or whether none of the above. We have never said that Kelly was the trigger person. We've never proceeded on the theory that the defendant was the one who actually shot him. We've always proceeded on an aiding and abetting theory in this case. And with respect to aiding and abetting, we have to show that the defendant intentionally assisted someone else in committing a crime. And if so, she's as guilty of committing that crime as if she were the trigger person. The assistance can be before or during the crime, and that she had to know that the crime was being committed at the time she offered her assistance. First-degree premeditated murder. We have to show that Jason Cochran intended Chris Reagan's death, that his death was actually caused by Jason Cochran, that the death was not excused or justified because it was some sort of crime of passion or something like that he actually intended to kill Jason Cochran, and that he premeditated his death, that he deliberated his death. Deliberation can include something as simple as lying in wait. And in this case, her own testimony was that Jason Cochran caused the death of Chris Reagan. that he intended to kill him, that he was killing him with a shotgun, that it was weighed out ahead of time. And deliberation means that there's some time for reflection before the plan is carried out. And in this case, ladies and gentlemen, we know that October 13th was the day that this plan was concocted, was carried out on October 14th. Larceny of building is a crime where we have to prove that the defendant took Chris Regan's property from the apartment, and she admitted she took the camera from the apartment, and that she intended to, or that it was taken without his consent, because he was obviously passed away at the time, and that she intended to permanently deprive him of the property, and that it was worth something at the time it was taken. The supporting evidence, of course, is her own statement. She admitted to taking the camera, she admitted to entering the apartment, and she admitted to throwing it away in the Wildwood Lake. That's her on October 16th, 2016, 1:58 p.m., walking past First Merit Bank, going east across the Jubilee parking lot. You can see she has something in her left hand. Conspiracy to commit dead bodies and mutilation. This isn't a charge that's used a lot, but then again, we don't get a case like this a lot. The defendant and someone else had to knowingly agree to commit, in this case, mutilation of a body, or carrying away of a human body. She had to specifically intend to commit or help commit that crime. And she testified numerous times that she drove Jason Cochran to the location where the body was dumped. She testified numerous times, or she admitted numerous times that she got the Sawzall cord for the defendant. Or excuse me, not for the defendant, but for Jason Cochran. She testified that this agreement took place between October 14th and October 27th of 2014 when they dumped the remains. Concealing the death of an individual. If you discover a dead body in Michigan, you have a responsibility to notify authorities. And in this matter, Kelly Cochran definitely admitted that she knew Chris Regan was dead. She talked about all of the things that she did to help cover up. She talked about her participation in the killing of Chris Regan. But she never notified authorities that he was deceased, at least not for a year and a half. Lying to a police officer in a violent crime investigation. She had to know that the police officers were conducting a criminal investigation. She had to make a false or misleading statement to a police officer during the investigation, and by her own admission, she made several false and misleading statements to not only Chief Brazil, but Detective Ogden during the course of the investigation. And that she did so knowingly and willfully. We also charged in the alternative, and this is with respect to the open murder charge. So as I indicated, open murder, we're proceeding on an aiding and abetting theory. You can choose either premeditated first-degree murder, or you can choose second-degree murder. You can choose none of the above. You can also choose in the alternative accessory after the fact to a felony. And in this offense, we have to prove that someone else committed the felony, that someone else being Jason Cochran, and that she assisted Jason Cochran to avoid discovery, arrest, and detection in the crime. And at the time she gave assistance, she knew that this other person had committed the felony. She knew Jason Cochran, in other words, had killed Chris Regan. Ladies and gentlemen, when normal people make a wedding vow, they commit to loving each other. When Jason Cochran and Kelly Cochran made a wedding vow, they committed to killing for each other. Right from their wedding night, they had a bond that regular people would never understand. They are both monsters. Her words, not mine. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendants in this matter were bonded in blood. Chris Regan was bathed in it. And at this time, I'm asking you to wash away the blood and find the defendant guilty of all counts.
Thank you, Ms. Paul. Members of the jury, these instructions are fairly lengthy, and Mr. Schilke has a closing he needs to give, and I don't want to keep you sitting here for too long a time. So we're going to take our morning recess. Please fight the natural temptation you'd have to discuss this case. You are not to discuss the case among yourselves even. You have not heard Mr. Schulke's closing. Ms. Powell has a right to give a rebuttal argument, and of course I have to instruct you on the law. So don't discuss the case before I order you to start your deliberations. And don't get concerned about the technical elements and proofs that are required. I'm going to be giving you a copy of the instructions that I give you orally. I'm going to give you a copy to take into the jury room with you. Okay, you're excused.
All rise.
Okay, please be seated. Anything for the record? Tell Yago I want to see her.
Pardon?
Tell Yago I'd like to see her. Okay, we'll stand in recess.
All rise. Court is in recess.